Okay, hello everyone and welcome to this webinar hosted by The Crowd. My name's Caroline McFarland, and for those of you who are new to The Crowd, The Crowd is a regular forum for sustainability professionals and related interests to come together to be inspired, discuss, debate, and learn from each other. Over the last year, we've hosted a range of different events in London, but we've also been exploring the ways to extend some of these discussions beyond the events themselves. So this webinar is the second that we are hosting this year, and we're looking forward to discussing setting long-term value chain targets and the challenges of setting those targets in companies with complex and distributed supply chains, some of the key things to consider when looking to develop a robust strategy which aligns operations with an ambitious vision, and learning about what industry leaders are doing now. This webinar is kindly co-hosted with our friends and supporters at Verco. Verco is an award-winning energy management and sustainability business with 30 years experience at the cutting edge of the low-carbon economy. Before I hand over to Andy Todd from Verco, who will be presenting the webinar, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you're having trouble with the audio, there is a number on the screen where you can dial in instead. And if you have any technical problems, please use the chat function, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. I'll also ask my colleague Simon to share the dial-in details via the chat function in case you need to redial in. The webinar will last no longer than an hour in total, and there will be a dedicated slot for questions towards the end of Andy's presentation. But if you do want to raise any questions in the meantime, please use the Q&A function again at the bottom of the screen to ask a question, and then we can feed those questions in midway through the presentation if needed. Great, okay, that's all from me. Thank you again for joining us, and handing over to Andy now.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Hi, everyone. I think I'll just start by introducing myself. I've been working with Verco for 12 years and head up our energy and resource management part of the business. I'm an engineer by background, but I've been working with kind of companies in and around setting carbon targets, both operationally focused and supply chain now for probably 7 or 8, 9 years now. And look forward to share some of my kind of insight around this area with you today. So hopefully that's it, sorry. So the structure of this webinar will be a quick introduction to Verco. Caroline mentioned a few things have introduced us quickly, so I won't spend too long on that. I probably want to give us a quick reminder on GHG reporting, just so that we kind of refresh some of the key terminology used. Talk a bit about what the value chain is and why it's becoming kind of used a lot more in target setting. Why we should be setting these targets, and that's probably where I'll stop and ask for some, if there's any questions around the content that up to that point. And then the last section will be really looking about how we often go about helping companies set targets and the considerations that are really worth bearing in mind when, as a company, you're looking to develop a target and also a kind of baseline reporting methodology, those two things. So just a quick introduction to Verco. So our vision is to provide solutions for a zero carbon world. And as Caroline mentioned, we've been around kind of 30 years, and we've always been around kind of the low carbon economy. We work with companies at a few levels, so at a kind of board and corporate level, helping them to develop a kind of strategy, all the way down to this kind of a site or a production level, where we've got engineers who are able to kind of put in data systems and help identify, quantify, and deliver kind of savings. And then with that, also kind of low carbon policies, and we find those two things really kind of interact well. As previously mentioned, we're employee owned with a 30-year track record. Yeah, it's been a few things that we've won consultancies awards, and B Co-op, very proud to be kind of supporting the B Co-op movement. And what we do is really wrap our services into one of three key areas, and they're around the aim for zero services, which are kind of our expert advice and strategic services to help kind of identify opportunities and risks. The deliver for zero, which are really like services and implementation. It's our kind of a team of engineers which help implement and these kind of changes. And then the report for zero, which is a really important part of the kind of feedback loop, where we use kind of industry leading software, either our own or we partner with kind of best in class solutions to provide the information and insight to help kind of drive these agendas. So some of you on the call now might be thinking, I'm not sure like who in the business is the right person for this. This is not something we've really kind of recognized or dealt with yet, and that's pretty common. And it's by its very nature, value chains, it spans different operational kind of remits. It's not easily packaged into one person's kind of role, and so often there's a bit of kind of exploring for a company to do and scoping to really understand how it fits kind of operationally. But they are becoming more and more important, kind of disclosing and reporting kind of value chain emissions, as well as kind of setting long-term targets. Companies are recognizing that climate change impact extends beyond their direct operations. For years, it's really been really the direct emissions that companies are responsible for, what they've really kind of focused on disclosing and targeting. And a really important point is that often the kind of scope 3, so the kind of wider impact, your supply chain impacts are far greater than the kind of more operationally focused and direct emissions. So there's a real kind of responsibility to tackle these emission sources. More and more so, the understanding value chain exposure to climate change is really kind of important opportunity for understanding risk, and as well as kind of exploiting kind of areas of opportunity. And then I think lastly, one of the most positive things I've seen from companies really tackling with value chain kind of emissions reductions is it provides a real platform and mandate for some innovation, which sometimes isn't always obvious without some kind of clear kind of vision for what needs to be done. So I'm just going to move on to what a quick reminder of GHG reporting. I'm sure some of these terms are familiar, but it's just good to kind of ground ourselves in the kind of the fundamentals before talking a bit more. So that's probably a diagram that a lot of people recognize. It's from the GHG protocol, the guidance document. And what that really shows is that GHG emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions, are really split into one of three scopes. Scope 1 are really your direct emissions. They're most commonly fuels that you combust, or it could be refrigerant gases or other things that you release from your kind of process. Scope 2 are typically, for most people, it's electricity. That's the biggest kind of contributor, but they can be kind of purchased heat or cooling or other things. And then all the kind of upstream and downstream emissions are what called scope 3. And what you will probably see is when you see a big kind of GHG kind of target, like 50% by 2025, that is normally scope 1 and 2 emissions. What we're starting to see becoming a little more common is kind of bold either value chain or scope 3 targets coming up, normally over a slightly longer horizon. Okay, the scope 3 categories. So the greenhouse gas protocol splits them into 15 categories. If I just look at the ones upstream, really they're kind of all the emissions associated with the purchased goods that you may use, or purchase goods and services, the kind of capital kind of goods or equipment that you purchase. There are emissions that relate to the kind of energy, fuel and energy that you use. That's often called like well to tank or transmission and distribution. There's kind of upstream transportation, so it's how things get to your site. If, for instance, if you're a manufacturing company, your inbound logistics. Waste generated from your operations, and then the kind of a couple of the employee ones like the business travel and employee commuting, and then one which is more of a kind of structural kind of or finance one, which is upstream leased assets. And then downstream, they're similar in theme. Obviously, downstream transportation and distribution. If you're making products, that's how you get your product to your kind of customer. There's the processing of sold products if there's further value add services, the emissions in use of your products. So if you're making kettles, for instance, it will be how much emissions associated with its life, how things are treated at the end of their life, and then there are a few categories for things like those downstream leased assets, franchises, and investments. So things that you might not have direct control or operational control over. So the sources of these emissions, or the source of scope 3 emissions, really do vary depending on the sector. And I've tried to cluster them into two. There was a report issued by the SBT, the Science Based Target Initiative, which took some responses to CDP, and I've just used some of the outputs from that report just to kind of show where typical sources are for different industries. So the first is kind of consumable manufacturers and retailers. I've kind of put it all in one good. So it's things that are kind of fast moving consumer goods typically. So it might be food and drink, pharmaceutical, retailers or textiles and kind of apparel. All of these have a similar kind of trait in the fact that the vast majority of their emissions sit in the purchased goods and services. So that's the kind of embodied emissions typically of what they're making. Other notable kind of sources are often kind of distribution and or transportation, and then a kind of few other kind of smaller kind of things coming in, but they're by far the biggest areas. The hardware manufacturers, construction, so these are people making kind of tools or buildings or something like that. So technology, hardware and equipment, construction engineering, machinery, cars, all those sort of things. As you can see here, the big kind of dominant kind of area is the use of products. And there's a real swing from the kind of fast-moving kind of goods to the kind of more kind of equipment and hardware-focused technology industries, and that's where there's the majority. There's still a significant representation from purchased goods and services, and the other kind of distribution and inbound kind of transportation. The last one is the kind of services and technology. It's a bit of a mixed bag, this, and so it might be kind of financial institutions, real estate kind of companies, professional services, software, and the point here is that it suddenly becomes a lot kind of more multicolored, and there's a kind of suddenly the employee kind of commuting and has a material impact. The kind of waste generated has a material impact, as well as other things like financial or investments and other things. So what we find in these areas that whilst maybe the absolute quantum of scope 3 emissions might be smaller, to really kind of have a strategy that deals with all, the significant areas is sometimes harder, and sometimes the data collection can be also as equally as challenging as some of these big companies. One other thing that's worth kind of pointing out in this response, in this data here, is that there's a category called others, which you'd think when there's 15 categories to assign your scope 3 emissions that you should be able to put it in one. And I think this just highlights that sometimes it's very difficult to get a real consistent level playing field. And although I haven't seen the source data for this, if I was to kind of guess, it might be that that these others were significant enough that they wanted to spell them out in their response. So it might be like third-party data systems, like data hosting, or it might be in kind of food and drink. It might be like embodied emissions of your packaging, for instance. So it's something that it should fall under another category. For instance, it would be purchased goods and services. It was just material enough to call out, and that might be the kind of thing that's gone on here, because there shouldn't really be any real others that don't fall into one of those 15 other categories. So just talking, so all of that was about scope 3, so just specifically the upstream and downstream emissions. Just want to just clarify what the kind of value chain is, because that is a term that's being used a lot now. So as we define it, as we understand it, it's the kind of value chain is the full range of activities needed to create a product or a service. So when you see it communicated in targets, it's often used to communicate emissions relating to all emission sources, so scope 1, 2, and 3. So you might see companies talk about just the 25% value chain reduction, emissions reductions, and that's going to be across their whole kind of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So if I was to look at, this is just a made up kind of very simple supply chain. And what we should see here are the kind of elements. So you might have raw materials, you might process those raw materials, you might then have a manufacturing step, and you're a manufacturing company. So this is kind of what your kind of business is. You then distribute your products. The products are used, and then they are kind of disposed of at end of life. And what the pie charts represent is the scope 1, 2, and 3 contributions of these kind of stages. And you can see that raw materials, you might have actually like just all scope 3. You have a slight kind of you might have a very small part of your operations vertically integrated. You might have some kind of processing of raw material operation. Then you've really got most of your emissions, scope 1 and 2 emissions. There's something gone wrong with the color scheme here, but scope 1 and 2 emissions are in your manufacturing, and then there's still a bit of scope 3, which might be your kind of transmission and distribution or well to tank. Your distribution operations, you might have some of your own fleet, but then rely heavily on third parties, and then your kind of product in use. And what I guess the value chain is just everything around the whole piece. And rather than just scope 1 and 2, which are little chunks from processing raw materials, most of it's manufacturing, and then maybe a quarter of your distribution. And that's kind of how companies are using to kind of define and really try and quantify their kind of overall kind of business impact of the products or services they provide. So I've spent quite a lot of time in brewing. They are quite early adopters of value chain kind of mapping, and I've worked with brewers probably the last 8 years or so, different brewing companies to kind of develop their kind of value chain targets. So here's a basic kind of value chain kind of the brewing is. So you've got agriculture, so that's where you're growing your kind of barley or other ingredients, wheat. You're processing that, and that still might be upstream of your operations. It goes into your brewing operations, and then also going into your brewing operations might be your packaging materials, and that's a really significant part of your kind of emissions. Then the products used, so it might be chilled and distributed, and then it's the packaging has a end of life. So it gets a bit more complicated than that because there's different transport legs between each thing, so things have to be moved around. Then you've actually got now a bit more sophistication in how kind of end of life should be treated, with materials being recycled, and some going to landfill, some going to incineration or whatever. And then some companies have slightly closed loop systems, so there might be returnable packaging. So for instance, like kegs, they go back to the brewery and then they get cleaned, refilled, and go back out again. And then there are other things in the kind of value chain which don't nicely map onto my flow chart, which are things like business travel, the waste from brewing. Even though they try to minimize that, there's still so the equipment that they buy. So all of those things also kind of feed into this, and then depending on the some of the other things are really dependent on the company structure, things like leased assets, franchises, investments. If we assume that they don't have any of those, then this kind of covers a lot of the kind of value chain. And what makes this easier, I think, to communicate is that you talk about the emissions that are to do with those operational parts of the value chain, as opposed to categories of the scope 3 categories, be it the purchased goods and services, which probably fall across a few of these areas and aren't very easy to align with what the business, how the business operates. So there are a number of rules, as anything. They're kind of ever evolving at the moment. They're there to kind of provide guidance, which obviously hopefully ensures robust approaches. I think depending on the sector, that some of this guidance is still open to some interpretation or definition. The kind of everything falls back really to the GHG protocol. They've got a standard for corporate reporting and a specific kind of subset or publication on reporting scope 3. They've then got further guidance focused on product life cycle accounting. Clearly kind of there is a difference in methodology between how you work for a value chain and a corporate, as for a product, which is like a unit of a product. But sometimes it does help. There's good references in there to help kind of help with the interpretation if you're not quite sure of how to go about something. There's other specifications as PAS 2050, which is a kind of publicly available standard for life cycle assessments for products. Then some sectors have gone a bit further. So the GHG kind of reporting, so the scope 3 accounting, I think was 2011. There's been some more kind of sector-led or industry-led kind of initiatives. There's the product environmental category rules that were developed in the kind of EU, across the EU recently, and then some kind of sectors have taken on that and provided their own guidance, which are very, very specific and quite robust. So when we're working with breweries now, it's very well defined. We're doing some work with a automotive company, and there's less there's still a bit of way to go to kind of make sure that there's a common set of way to report across the industry. But there is an increasing amount of sector-specific guidance that's starting to emerge. So that might be a good point to just have a break if there's any specific questions on what was raised to this point.
Thanks, Andy.
Yep.
If anyone has any questions, then use the chat functionality at the bottom of your screens. Otherwise, we haven't had any come through so far.
Brilliant. So shall I give it Like 20 seconds.
Yes, that would be great. So we have one question. Hang on one sec. There's also a Q&A box where you can ask questions as well. So there is a Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, or you can use the chat functionality. So
am I meant, do you want me to look at them, or is it a?
No, I can read them out to you. There's a couple of questions so far, which is what about ISO 14064? There is another question about how we handle the tension between marketing and the truth on brand labeling.
Okay. So the 14, so it's the kind of ISO standard 14064. Yes, they're right. That's a management standard for producing or reporting on kind of GHG. I think that is something you can definitely do. That's almost a validation of the way to go about it. It's puts a lot more emphasis on kind of going through the right processes and steps, and it's that's kind of been our experience of it. It's less kind of guidance on specific methodology, but it's the kind of standard at which you would kind of accredit something to. So it is part of it, but it's probably you would use the GHG protocol to help inform your approach to methodology, and then you'd go through the process of implementing that using the kind of ISO standard. If that makes sense. They're kind of slightly two different things, I would probably argue, but they're certainly related. What was the second question was a bit more evocative. What was it? Something about the marketing and...
Yes, the tension between marketing and the truth on brand labeling.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that is probably something that's becoming more and more pressing as the kind of brand value associated with kind of responsibly manufactured products are becoming increasingly recognized, or people are being aware of. The consumer awareness is increasing. There is always going to be a conflict because marketing and advertising kind of want snappy, easy to communicate, high impact challenges. And it's much more nuanced than this. So what you need to kind of do as kind of professionals and the kind of advocates of this area, of this space within your companies or in the kind of wider profession is really create excitement around this, to try and say, look, there is real value, but also make sure that you are responsible in terms of understanding where the risk is, and the kind of attitudes can change quite quickly in this area. And someone making a comment today and then in 2 years' time might be seen as kind of through a much more cynical lens as just trying to get kind of marketing output. So I think there's a responsibility to try and create excitement in your organizations that this is actually something that can be really value adding, but also have enough of a robust approach that you're able to kind of highlight the risk of making kind of claims maybe slightly ahead of when they ought to be. I don't know if that answers the question, but is there any other? Yep.
That looks like that's all the questions for now. If anyone does want to submit any further questions, please continue to do so with the chat function or the Q&A box.
Yeah. Great. So, bear with me. Okay, so just a few of kind of why a company might set a value chain target. It's becoming when I was starting to talking about these maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, some of these I start thinking, oh, these are a bit not very tangible, but they they are now more than ever kind of becoming really kind of much more understood and valued. So the first one is kind of what businesses start with is like to manage risk. So one is managing risk around the actual value chain. So if you've got really high emitting kind of parts of your value chain, then that might be a good proxy to understand where kind of risks may sit as the kind of world transitions to a low carbon economy. Others is to kind of manage investor and maybe consumer or customer expectation and be able to engage with them. The kind of second area is around managing to really engage with your supply chain on an area that should be mutually beneficial and provide a platform for kind of innovation. And I think when we've worked before with a kind of drinks company, it wasn't before we had a carbon target around kind of their packaging, which until they started really looking at what was possible for lightweighting, for material substitution, for because it wasn't really driving a huge cost reduction. It did in the end drive a cost reduction, but it wasn't ever the kind of the urgent thing to be dealing with. The other thing is that a lot of companies maybe scope 1 and 2 emissions might only account for 20% or sometimes less of their total kind of emissions, and setting a kind of ambitious value chain target, you can really generate a much larger reduction in emissions. And then just to last, I guess it's linked to the innovation point, but just to kind of drive efficiency across the kind of supply chain, and that should help all parties if done correctly. So now, as I mentioned before, the kind of setting these targets is becoming increasingly common. I've used the Science Based Target Initiative as a kind of proxy. So the reason I've done that is that if you're going to have a science-based target accepted and scope 3 emissions are above a certain percentage, I think 40% of your total, then you do need to set a target for scope 3. And so you can infer that if 714 companies have committed to setting a science-based target, a lot of them, probably the vast majority of them, will have to be setting a scope 3 target. And what you're also starting to see is companies as a whole setting value chain targets. And these are a selection of companies. I mean, I could have chosen a lot more, but these are kind of a selection of kind of multi kind of industry companies that are specifically using value chain in their kind of target settings. So you've got obviously there's some well-known food and drink type companies, some pharmaceutical companies like agrochemicals, services companies, construction companies, steel kind of manufacturers, tech kind of software companies, consumer goods. So it's really across the industry now, and it's not really the kind of preserve of the leaders anymore. It's becoming a kind of something that a lot of companies are kind of actively looking at. So just want to now talk about how can you go about setting a target. So I'm going to talk about the kind of approach that we might take, or the journey would take a kind of client on, and hopefully through that pull out some kind of key kind of insights and reflections that will hopefully help you avoid some of the kind of learnings that the lessons that we've had to learn previously. So we've got 6 stages in our in where we think the journey for kind of setting a target. So it starts with a kind of materiality assessment and boundary definition. I mean, this is very much GHG protocol kind of approach. Then we look at develop the actual methodology to report. Then look at what data sources you need and where we're going to get them from. So in the data mapping phase, kind of develop a baseline, model scenarios. We'll come back to that in a minute, and then finally develop targets. So for each of these stages, I just want to talk about the kind of key activities and what comes out of it. So first, in the materiality assessment, the point of this is to basically try and, as much as possible, identify the scope, as much of the scope 3 sources as possible, and develop. And you're going to be using estimates here, and there are they are a number of kind of ways of doing that. Some are much more kind of data intensive than others, but there's some guidance on the GHG protocol, but there's also probably some now emerging some more sector specific guidance. I'll probably use that ahead of the more generic areas. And then what you need to do is, for each of those areas that you've produced an estimate on, is like assess the kind of size, your company's influence, the risks. So they're all the considerations when like completing a kind of materiality. So it's how material it is to your business. And then from that, you want to kind of identify what is the area we're going to look at for what we're going to call our kind of scope 3, and what can we realistically report on. Then once you've kind of got that, you want to develop a methodology, align it with the kind of key standards. As I say, if you wanted to get it accredited to the ISO standard, that's kind of an option. You want to consider the key functionality of the kind of way you're reporting, and what I mean by that is that you've got something that gives you a result. You then want to understand how you want to see that information, what outputs you need, what is actually going to drive business information and decision making, rather than just giving you a once a year output for kind of GHG assessment. And then you can't really do this early enough, but engage with your key suppliers. So a lot of how effective company reporting data they can get. So the outcome of this is understanding what data you need, and define the kind of key reporting outputs. The data mapping, this is a stage that you really can't overlook, and it's where I've seen companies fall over in the past, is that they haven't really done this well, and then 2 years down the line, lots of people have moved jobs, and it's been very, very difficult. So you really want to develop a schedule of all the kind of data sources you need, assign it ownership internally, document it, and then start considering automation. I haven't really touched on this yet, but there is a play for automation in this space. Definitely, it's going to, certainly as kind of technology moves on, there's a greater demand. There will be easier ways of collecting data. Coming from this, clearly defined data sources nodes. That is a great basis for which to have a kind of GHG reporting methodology. Finally, now we're actually getting into the reporting part. So you'll have developed some kind of reporting model, calculation, or even a software platform, and we need to populate that with data. That would develop your baseline. And at this stage, you've really got to work through the inevitable data issues. There will be data issues. It is, if you imagine you might be getting data from so many different parts of your business. You'll be getting information from suppliers in different formats. And they might change it. Different geographies. It's data issues is a constant, or not constant, but certainly a expected part of the process. And what that gives you is your baseline value chain footprint. You may not want to report that as your baseline, but at least now you've got something that you understand what your kind of actual emissions are. And what we find next is really useful is, before you start looking at targets, is to just try and understand how your scope 3 emissions or your value chain emissions change on how your business, on key business drivers. So businesses, when you're setting targets on like a 10-year horizon, it can be very difficult for companies to understand how they'll be operating, but there's general trends that they're probably accepting of. So it might be changing business models. So if you're a retailer, you might be moving away from more kind of retail shops, physical shops, to an online business. That can have kind of significant impact on your scope 3 emissions. It could be that you're kind of product mix is changing. It could be that your geography, like where you're operating, is likely to change. All of these things can be quite easily modeled if you do this part right. And then what you can then do before going into the developing target stage is really understand kind of where you think the kind of company is likely to be, and with a certain boundary of kind of confidence. And that what that allows you to do is develop targets with an understanding of the kind of likely business as usual direction. And then it will also allow you to really consider sub-targets. And then the outcome of that, hopefully, is to set challenging yet achievable targets, which is the kind of balance that everyone's looking for. So I've just got some kind of considerations before we kind of leave. So this is to how we develop a value chain reporting approach. So this is like developing the baseline model. One is try and capture everything as much as possible to start with. It might feel like a quite onerous activity. It's good in terms of the rigor of the approach, but also you quite often in some voluntary disclosure kind of CDP or other things where you're asked to, have you considered these emissions? And if you say yes, and we did it and it was less than 1.1%, that kind of deals with that, and it's a good justification as to why you haven't included it into your boundary. It isn't good to say we didn't really model it, we think it's just too insignificant. So try and make it as broad as possible. Then really define your boundary and map out data sources with owners. It's such a useful reference in kind of 2-3 years into the program when people have moved and people are challenging why certain decisions were made and where certain data comes from. That's a very useful step. Engage with your suppliers, understand what data they can provide and how it's been calculated. That's really important. You want as much granularity as possible, and it's another kind of almost certainty is that data sets are likely to improve over time. So what you might want to say is like, right, you're going to give me some estimate, or you're going to give me a basic apportionment based on how much of your product you sell to us. That's okay this year, but actually next year we'd want it much more, we'd want it a bit more granular, and can you start putting the systems in now that allow you to do this? So that's good to have that kind of understood. So you utilize technology where appropriate and help data collection and consolidation. So much of this challenge is about collecting the right data, which is kind of verifiable or can stand up to scrutiny in a fashion that's efficient and can consolidate easily. And they are starting to see technology platforms that will start enabling some of this. And then have a well-defined and tested reporting methodology. So before looking to automate that step. So what we've seen, I mean, we work sometimes with automatic platforms, or we do kind of specific bespoke models or whatever but you really want to test the reporting methodology and before kind of going into full operational kind of mode where it becomes a lot harder to kind of verify. They're just some considerations to when looking at kind of developing that reporting approach. If I start talking about setting a target, target scope and time frame, I mean, that's a basic question, but it is important. So quite often you end up with a kind of top down versus bottom up. So you look at what peers might be doing, but also what the ambition of your company is, and what kind of is this realistic time frame. You haven't really spoken about this yet, but senior management buy-in is really, really, really important. If you look at any of the kind of barriers and the publications on what you should do and the key barriers, and senior management buy-in is kind of important. Get buy-in early, say this is why we're doing it, this is why it's important, this is kind of why there's a target. That will help you with the kind of implementation. third is to make every effort to get primary data for really significant parts of your kind of value chain segments, and really try and do that in your baseline year, even if your data comes late. So what that means is that sometimes you can get a little bit kind of hamstrung by what your reporting methodology is in your kind of reporting year, or baseline year, to demonstrate savings that you've had through kind of various initiatives and uh, improvements that your suppliers might have done, or whatever it is. So it's a really invaluable getting that as much good data as early as possible. Even if it's provided a year late, you can re-baseline, but it's really important that your kind of baseline year has the same reporting methodology as your reporting year, if you're trying to get kind of third-party assurance for kind of improvements or something like that. Second, penultimately, the point around the scenario modeling. So really try and understand the value chain impacts of the wider business trends and drivers, and that's really good context in which to set a target. If you don't really understand how that's going to move, you can either set a too kind of cautious target, or set a target and see your kind of scope 3 emissions start moving the wrong way. And then once you've kind of set the target, is really start considering how you set operationally relevant sub-targets. It's almost certain that the delivery of this target will rely on a number of different functions in a business, and those functions don't really work on kilograms of CO2 equivalents. And so it might be that your logistics people, so the people that are working with your third-party logistics operators, they might have targets to do with percentage alternative fuels, or minimum or fuel efficiency, or something like that, but making it more relatable to them. And likewise with packaging, you might have people that have targets to certain recycled content, or whatever it is, but make it more operationally aligned to them, but when it all wraps up, gets you to your kind of value chain target. So I think that was my kind of last kind of point, and I guess there's now another opportunity for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Andy. So we have 4 questions so far. I'll run through them one by one, but we do have a little bit of time for further questions if you would like to submit via the chat box or the Q&A function. So the first question, if all your suppliers are third parties, how do you gather accurate data?
That's yeah, I mean, that is one of the challenges. It is a challenge that most companies, or a lot of companies, will have. What you, depending on the nature of the business, you might have like hundreds or thousands of suppliers. So what you're probably going to be wanting to do is look at really significant suppliers and work with them to try and get, be it primary or something that's close to as possible to that data that you can include. It's important to kind of understand that those companies will have kind of disclosure requirements as well. And like the CDP supply chain initiatives are trying to kind of help that. But it's to do with identifying the kind of most material ones, and really being clear what data you need for your reporting methodology. Otherwise, there might be other kind of slightly more passive routes to get the data, but that's probably the kind of best way. But it is one of the biggest challenges.
Thank you. And from a standing start, how quickly can you get to approved science-based targets?
So it's, I mean, that's quite, again, it slightly depends on the industry. If it's standing start by means of you haven't done anything to understand your supply chain or get data, you might be talking a kind of 6 to 12 month kind of as a kind of fairly ambitious time frame. If you've got a well-defined kind of if it's a case of actually you understand your reporting, you've got a reporting baseline and methodology. It's just a case of setting targets and making sure they're aligned to the requirements of science and getting that through the verification process. That's probably like a 3-month, 4-month minimum. It depends on the SBTI, I have to say. I mean, at the moment, they're not. I don't think they're actually responding to things until after Christmas. So it's something depending on their need, and obviously their demand on them needing to verify can go in peaks and troughs, so it can vary.
Great, thank you. So quite a few more questions coming in. The next one's from James, who asks, when setting value chain targets, it can be difficult to balance an ambitious target that drives performance with the risk of not achieving it because of the lack of direct influence or management. So can you share your experience and any advice about how to reach a good balance?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on how engaged your senior management are in. I've got probably two examples of companies in similar industries, and one had a really clear senior management mandate, and they both set similarly ambitious targets, but one company found it much more easily to achieve because they had no trouble convincing their kind of colleagues in different functions of the business that they needed to do this, and accepting an operational kind of target for them. And that came from kind of top-down pressure. The other kind of company was probably thinking, actually, well, we need to do something here, and we want to make a good thing, but they didn't really do the kind of senior management engagement, and we found it really difficult getting those operational targets, so kind of the sub targets for the different parts of the business accepted, understood, engaged with, and what that does is just drive down reduces your ambition as well. So the best way is to get senior management buy-in straight away, and that might seem an obvious answer, but it's certainly kind of certainly the best way. So senior management buy-in backed up by kind of really credible kind of reporting, modeling, or evidence to give the kind of senior management confidence that we can manage this problem.
Okay, thank you. Tom asks, how do you divide the responsibility for value chain scope 3 emissions between the companies directly responsible for those emissions, the company responsible for the final product, and the consumer?
So how do you divide? Okay, so the scope 3 emissions. I'm maybe missing. So if you are the company who is making something, the I guess responsibility of those scope 3 emissions are by default someone else's kind of operational responsibility. Depending on what they are, the kind of you as a company should bear some or little of the responsibility. So for something like a retailer, for instance, who sometimes has to fly things in or sometimes has to ship things in, that's might be for goods, but that's something that and they should bear some responsibility for that. In terms of reporting, it's a bit of a grey area. Likewise with the consumer, I mean, it's something that you can try and drive behaviour and give consumer information, and that's probably the responsibility of the kind of the company or the manufacturing company or the provider of a product. But again, the consumer needs to take some responsibility. The world, or we're never going to really transition to a true zero carbon economy if there isn't equal kind of or a proportionate amount of responsibility across all three parties. But as the kind of company in the middle, they have a real platform to be able to influence both upstream and downstream. So that could be their kind of corporate responsibility, if you like, to try and drive and change that behaviour.
Great, thank you. Okay, penultimate question from Amy, which is around how this can be applied to the healthcare sector. So she says the mission of the NHS is health and well-being of local populations, but your slide on why we should set Scope 3 targets didn't quite work for our kind of organisation. And some of these Scope 3 targets seem too disconnected to current issues around local air quality, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any advice on engaging senior management on Scope 3 in a healthcare context?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good kind of point. I think what that is, the benefits are very kind of corporate focused. I think managing risk, etc. I think what the some organisations such as the NHS almost has to be almost leading by example for the good of all the people, and so it naturally forms around well-being, kind of locally sourced, all those kind of things. So there's a alignment with kind of Scope 3. It might not be that Scope 3 is the kind of suddenly the kind of target that they're setting. It might be a measure that of some of the kind of initiatives that they're trying to kind of promote. So like being active in the community, sourcing locally, kind of being a positive contributor, whatever those kind of things are. Scope 3 emissions might be a decent metric, but maybe a difficult thing to target to get kind of buy-in. Would be it sounds like it's probably one component of a 6 or 7 kind of a balanced scorecard of metrics.
Thank you. Okay, finally, we have 2 questions on data. So what would be your recommendation in terms of data collection and reporting so that it doesn't create a complex data monster, which is very difficult to manage in terms of human resources and budgets? And then do you have any advice on the auditing of data used in calculations?
Yeah, so the first question about how to manage the complexity of data is definitely one of the biggest challenges of these kind of Scope 3 or value chain reporting activities. The reason it's complicated is because it's data. It's not something that you're having to go and find it, and it might not already be there. So the mapping part is really important. So to really understand kind of what data you need and where it is and who owns it, and that's kind of one important thing. It is likely to become complex. I mean, it's just the nature of it. The second kind of part is to really mainly only focus on the areas that are the most material in terms of the kind of really, like, you don't have to get perfect data in absolutely every part of your value chain. So focus on the most material, the things that you can have most influence over, the things that should actually drive better value for your business. So if you start improving your logistic, by setting targets or the way your procurement activity works improves the efficiency of your third-party logistics operators, then that should have kind of a direct kind of alignment with your kind of company kind of objectives. So focus on areas that are most important, and then I guess there is a potentially more and more a role to play with kind of technology, be it kind of supply chain engagement kind of platforms that kind of are easy for your suppliers to kind of provide their data for, to the more kind of advanced connected kind of network kind of supply chain data platforms which are starting to emerge. I'm not an expert in these yet. It's still kind of emerging, but it's that is probably where the kind of the data challenge is going to end up for some of this. And that would probably lead into the second part of the question around how do you kind of manage audit kind of trail or provide kind of auditable data, it's probably having some kind of software platform will help, being able to kind of demonstrate kind of where the data's come from, when it was loaded, that it hasn't changed, rather than managing like hundreds and hundreds of spreadsheets. The systems where you can actually upload kind of the reference documents and kind of almost put that in somewhere else and automatically see where data gaps are and all that kind of stuff will help that. But be kind of prepared that it's going to be a process of explaining your methodology, why you've taken certain decisions, why that you've had to make an assumption there, and that's kind of a lot more of the process of going through kind of third-party assurance than you'd be used to with just your mandatory reporting declarations for scope 1 and 2. So a methodology statement is very good and important to have as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andy. I think that's all we have time for. Is there anything else you'd like to close with?
Not really. I think it's it's a really interesting topic, this area. It's kind of starting to get some real momentum, and I'm kind of quite excited to see where companies, how ambitious companies are going to be, and where it kind of drives the industry. So hopefully I'll be back in a year or so saying it's all kind of automatic data platforms, and it's just a case about how ambitious now rather than some of these challenges, but maybe not. So cool. Well, thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much to all of the attendees. You've been listening to a presentation from Andrew Todd from Verco, and Verco's details and website are on the screen now. I'm Caroline McFarland from The Crowd, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, The Crowd is a regular forum for sustainability professionals. We host bi-monthly events on various issues relating to economic, social and environmental sustainability. So if you're not already a regular attendee of the Crowd's events, do get in touch if you'd like to find out more. Our 2020 programme of events will be announced shortly. And this is only the second time we have produced a webinar this year, so we will be emailing you to ask for feedback and keep you up to date of other new opportunities to engage with our work. For those of you that have given us the respective permissions, we'll be sending you the materials from this webinar and the recording, and get in touch if there's anything else we can do to help you with your business challenges and goals. So thank you very much for participating, and do give us some feedback on the content of the webinar and tell us what you'd like to know more about in future. Thank you.